You wake to the sound of iron scraping stone. The air in your cell smells of damp earth and decay. 3 days ago, you were a woman with a name, a home, a life that made sense. Now you are something else entirely. The guards haven't spoken to you since they dragged you here, but you've heard them talking outside your door. They're building something in the square. You heard the word tomorrow more than once. You press your ear against the gap beneath the door and catch fragments of conversation. A blacksmith discussing the temperature needed to make iron glow red. A carpenter explaining how quickly flesh tears. Your husband's voice, calm and certain, describing what you allegedly did. The conversation he claims you had with the merchant, the smile he says meant betrayal. You never touched the man, you barely spoke to him. But in medieval Europe, that distinction won't save you. The accusation has already been made, and the accusation is the weapon. If this glimpse into one of history's darker systems fascinates you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. I'm genuinely curious, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your location in the comments. It's remarkable how people from every continent gather here to explore the uncomfortable truths our ancestors left behind. What's about to unfold isn't legend or folklore. This is documented history, preserved in court records, legal codes, church archives, and chronicles written by the people who witnessed these events. The punishment of women accused of adultery in medieval Europe was systematic, widespread, and devastatingly efficient. It lasted for centuries. It spanned from England to Italy, from France to the Germanic territories. And at its core was a legal framework specifically designed to ensure that once a woman was accused, she had almost no possibility of defending herself. To understand what happened to accused adulteresses, you must first understand how the accusation functioned within medieval legal systems. The architecture of medieval justice was built on a foundation of profound gender inequality, codified in both civil and canon law. A husband's testimony about his wife's behavior carried the weight of sworn evidence. His word was presumed truthful by default. The legal principle, embedded in codes like the Sachsenspiegel from 13th century Germany and reinforced in the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1532, was explicit. A woman's voice in cases of moral transgression was legally inadmissible. The reasoning, stated plainly in these documents, held that women were inherently deceptive, that their nature inclined them toward manipulation, and that their testimony in their own defense would inevitably be corrupted by self-interest and lies. This meant that a husband could accuse his wife based on nothing more than suspicion, or interpretation, or deliberately manufactured evidence. She could be condemned for being seen in conversation with a man who wasn't her husband, for lingering too long at the market, for asking questions about matters considered beyond her domestic sphere, for displaying any interest or agency that suggested independence of thought. The standard of proof wasn't evidence of a physical act. It was the appearance of impropriety, and that appearance was determined entirely by male judgment. Women had no legal standing to contest the accusation, no right to present witnesses on their behalf, no ability to challenge the interpretation of their behavior. Once the charge was formally made, conviction followed with the inevitability of winner, and conviction triggered a sequence of punishments designed not merely to inflict pain, but to achieve something more comprehensive, the complete erasure of the woman as a social being. These punishments had evolved over centuries, refined through practice, standardized across regions. They followed patterns that were remarkably consistent whether you examine the records from 13th century England, 14th century France, 15th century Germany, or 16th century Italy. The methods varied in detail, but the underlying principles remained constant. Public humiliation, physical mutilation, permanent marking, social destruction, and in many cases, death, though not always immediate. The scope of this system was vast. Parish records, municipal court documents, and monastic chronicles contained thousands upon thousands of cases. In Nuremberg alone, between 1400 and 1450, The city's legal records document 347 women subjected to adultery punishments. In London, during the same period, the court rolls show 412 cases. These are just the documented instances in 2 cities during 5 decades. Across all of Europe, across 3 centuries of medieval jurisprudence, the number reaches into the hundreds of thousands. Every accusation set in motion a machinery of violence that operated with bureaucratic efficiency. The punishment always began with seizure. The woman would be taken from her home, often without warning, sometimes in the middle of the night. Guards would enter, pull her from her bed or her work, and drag her into the street. Her protests were legally irrelevant. Her husband's accusation was the only testimony that mattered. In southern German territories and parts of Austria, the method of transport to the place of judgment was itself a form of preliminary punishment. She would be grabbed by her hair and pulled through the streets toward the town square. Her scalp would tear, blood would mat her hair. By the time she reached the square, her face was already swollen and bruised. The square itself would already be filling with people. Medieval justice was fundamentally public. Punishments were spectacles, designed to be witnessed by the entire community. The logic was pedagogical. If others saw what happened to women who violated their marriage vows, or who were accused of doing so, they would be deterred from similar transgressions. Fear was the mechanism of social control, and fear required visibility. What happened next followed protocols that varied by region but shared common elements. In England, the woman might be locked into the pillory, a wooden restraint that held her head and hands in a bent position. The pillory wasn't merely uncomfortable, it was deliberately torturous. The holes were sized to press against the throat, making breathing difficult. The bent posture caused severe pain in the back and neck within minutes. Standing locked in this position for 3 hours, the standard duration, caused muscle damage that could last for weeks. But the physical constraint was only the beginning. While locked in the pillory, the woman became a target. The crowd didn't merely observe. They participated. Participation was expected. In medieval communities, refusing to join in public punishment was socially suspect. It suggested sympathy for the criminal, which could mark you as morally compromised yourself. So everyone joined in. They threw things, rotten vegetables saved specifically for this purpose. The contents of chamber pots, mud mixed with animal waste. Stones, not large enough to cause immediately fatal injuries because the authorities wanted her to survive the pillory, but large enough to draw blood, to open wounds, to cause pain. Children participated. Parents lifted them up for better throwing angles. Young boys competed to see who could hit her with the most disgusting projectiles. They laughed. They celebrated each successful throw. They were learning. Through direct participation, they internalized the lesson that this was proper treatment for women who transgressed, or who were accused of transgressing. Young girls watched from the edges, learning what would happen to them if they ever strayed from obedience to their future husbands. In German territories, the punishment often took the form of a parade. The woman would be stripped completely naked and forced to walk through every street of the village. The route was carefully planned to ensure that every household, every resident, every person in the community would witness her humiliation. A man followed behind her with a whip, striking her back and legs with each step. The whip was not symbolic, it was leather, sometimes studded with small metal points. After the first several strikes, it broke the skin, blood ran down her back and legs. She screamed with each blow, reduced to pure animal suffering. The entire village participated in this parade. Women she had known for years spat on her as she passed. Men threw stones, made crude comments about her body, reduced her to an object for their entertainment. The parade lasted hours, sometimes circling through the village multiple times. By the end, the woman was barely recognizable. Her body was covered completely in mud, blood, excrement, and rotten food. Her back and legs were torn open. Her feet were bleeding from walking barefoot over rough ground and sharp stones. She was barely conscious. But the punishment wasn't finished. In many regions, particularly in southern Germany and parts of Austria, branding came next. The woman would be brought before the blacksmith. An iron rod shaped into a letter, usually an A for adulteress, or, in some regions an H for Hure, the German word for whore, would be heated in the forge until it glowed red enough to boil water on contact. The blacksmith would press this glowing metal against her flesh, typically on her face, the cheek or the forehead, places where the mark would be immediately visible to everyone who saw her for the rest of her life. The sound was audible across the entire square, the sizzle of burning flesh. The smell filled the air, acrid and nauseating. The woman's scream seemed to come from somewhere beyond the human range, a sound of such pure agony that witnesses would remember it for years. The blacksmith held the iron in place for several seconds, ensuring the brand would scar deep enough to be permanent, deep enough to remain legible forever. When the iron was removed, the flesh was charred black in the center with red blistering tissue radiating outward. The wound bled and used clear fluid. From that moment forward, everyone who saw her would know. The letter burned into her skin announced her shame to anyone who looked at her face. She would never be able to hide what she had been convicted of. She would never be able to start over somewhere else where people didn't know her history. In some regions, branding wasn't enough, mutilation was standard. The woman's left ear would be cut off, not surgically, not with precision. The blacksmith would use a knife meant for cutting leather. He would grab her ear and saw through the cartilage while men held her down. Cartilage is tough. It took time. It hurt beyond the capacity of language to describe. The severed ear would be dropped to the ground where it would be trampled by the crowd pressing forward to see better. These marks served a purpose beyond immediate punishment. They were permanent markers that prevented escape. When women tried to leave their villages and start over elsewhere, the brand on their face announced to everyone they encountered exactly what they had been convicted of. The meanings of these brands were standardized across much of Europe. Anyone who saw the letter understood immediately. Women with these marks were driven away from town after town. In one place, men would throw stones at them until they fled. In another, magistrates would order them to leave immediately on pain of further whipping. In a third, women would surround them and beat them with sticks, accusing them of trying to corrupt the community with their presence. In England and parts of France, another punishment followed the public humiliation, the ducking stool. The woman would be brought to the river and forced into a wooden chair attached to a long beam that functioned as a lever. Her arms would be bound to the armrests, her body secured with rope. She couldn't move or protect herself. The operator would pull the lever and she would be plunged into water that was often brutally cold, sometimes just above freezing, fed by snowmelt in spring. The sudden immersion caused an involuntary gasp. She would inhale water into her lungs. She would choke, struggle against her bonds, feel her lungs burning, her vision darkening at the edges. Just as she was on the verge of losing consciousness, the operator would raise her out of the water. She would break the surface coughing and gasping, vomiting up water, her body shaking violently from the cold. But she would be given only seconds to catch her breath before being plunged under again. This would happen 20 times. 30 times, sometimes more. Each immersion counted aloud by the crowd, who chanted the numbers in unison like spectators at a grotesque sporting event. 1, 2, 3. Each time she went under, she was held there longer, the operator carefully calibrating how long he could keep her submerged without actually killing her. By the 10th ducking, many women stopped struggling. They hung limp in the chair between immersions. By the 15th, they were no longer making any sound when they came up. Their skin had turned blue from cold, their breathing was shallow and labored. The medical aftermath of these punishments was devastating. The infections that developed from branding, from the contamination of the river water during ducking, from the wounds left by whipping, these didn't heal cleanly. Medieval medicine had no understanding of bacteria or antiseptic technique. The burns from branding would become severely infected within days. The flesh would swell massively, turning dark purple and green with streaks of red radiating outward, indicating blood poisoning spreading through the body. The woman would develop a high fever, her body fighting multiple infections simultaneously. Some survived, others died from sepsis within weeks. But physical damage was only part of the destruction. The social consequences were total and permanent. Once convicted, the woman's marriage was automatically dissolved. In most of medieval Europe, when a marriage ended due to the wife's adultery, the husband kept all marital property. Not just property acquired during the marriage, but even the dowry that the woman's family had provided when she married. The dowry that was supposed to be her security, her protection, her insurance against poverty. Her husband took everything. The house, the furnishings, the money, the goods. The woman was left with literally nothing except the filthy dress she had worn during her punishment. She couldn't work in any respectable trade. No one would hire a woman branded on the face as an adulteress. The brand was specifically designed to make her unemployable, to ensure she could never rebuild a normal life. She couldn't work as a servant in any household because her presence was believed to corrupt the moral atmosphere. Morality was thought to be contagious in medieval thinking. Both virtue and vice spread from person to person through association. A branded adulteress in a household would contaminate the virtue of other servants, or so the reasoning went. She couldn't work with other women in textile production, the most common form of female labor, because other women refused to associate with her. They claimed she would corrupt them, or that they couldn't be seen with such a woman without damaging their own reputations. The only work available was the most degrading and dangerous. Collecting refuse from streets, cleaning latrines, perhaps selling her body, though even in that profession, the brand made her less desirable than unmarked women. Some women tried to escape. They left their villages hoping to find somewhere new to start over. But the brand made this impossible. In every town they entered, people saw the letter burned into their skin and knew immediately what it meant. They were driven away again and again. They survived by begging on roads between settlements. They slept in ditches or abandoned buildings. They ate whatever scraps they could find. The chronic illness from their punishments weakened them progressively. The repeated near drownings caused permanent lung damage. The infections from the brands spread through facial tissue, causing nerve damage, chronic pain, facial paralysis, scarring that pulled the mouth into a permanent grimace. Some women died on the roads after only a few years. Their bodies were found in ditches, frozen in winter, buried in unmarked graves meant for criminals and beggars. Parish registers wrote the same cold line every time: an adulterous woman found dead on the roadside. For noble women, the punishment looked different, but cut just as deep. Public mutilation risked blood feuds. So, instead they were erased quietly. A noble woman accused of adultery could be locked in a remote convent reached only by harsh mountain paths, a penitentiary disguised as holy ground. Inside, she lost everything. Her noble clothes were stripped away, her hair was shaved. She lived in a stone cell barely big enough to lie down. One meal a day. Silence. No letters, no visitors, no news. Only forced confessions during endless services, repeated until she broke. Many spent decades like this. Records from a 15th century German convent describe Beatrice, accused but never proven guilty. She tried to starve herself after 5 years. The nuns force-fed her 3 times a week for half a year. She survived only to remain imprisoned for 32 more years, dying at 71. In 1379, a woman named Elenina was punished not for an affair, but for speaking to a visiting nobleman about finances. Her husband called it betrayal. She was immured, sealed alive beneath the castle. For 6 days she survived. Then she heard the workers closing the opening. She begged the steward she'd known since childhood. He didn't look at her. Stone by stone, the light disappeared. She lived 42 more days in darkness before dying alone. Her story is one of thousands. Marjorie was branded and died on the road. Isabella spent 23 years locked in a convent cell. Alice died in a ditch after being mutilated. Most victims remain nameless, erased from history. And this happened at the heart of Christian Europe and lands of cathedrals, universities, and theology. The same civilization that celebrated learning also created a system designed to terrorize women into obedience. Remember Ella Lanina, remember Beatrice, remember all the women whose suffering was normalized, documented, and accepted as justice.